Over Christmas, I was thinking about the preachers that we would have in 2020, and I was thinking that it would be nice to do a series in one book of the Bible and just have some time focusing on what God has to tell us from that book. So I started thinking and I started praying, and I really got excited about studying James, really getting my teeth into what James has to say, because it's such a practical book. It's so down to earth and real, and I thought it would be a great way of us learning more of what it is to be church in 2020. Little did I know that by the time I got round to actually doing any of these talks, we would be in this virtual space because of a worldwide pandemic. But clearly God knew, because the first chapter in James is all about suffering. It's all about our response when things are tough. So let's read James chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all that they do. Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away, even while they go about their business. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because, having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to all who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of all he created. When I was growing up, I had a real sense of God's presence in my life. There were ups and downs, there were things that I found difficult, but I always felt like he was preparing me for something ahead. Then somewhere in my early 20s, I started to feel like God wasn't speaking to me anymore. I guess there were lots of reasons for that, but he did seem more distant. I used to pray and beg for that sense of closeness, that sense of guidance, but there was nothing. Yet somewhere in my heart, I knew he was still there. I knew he still loved me. It almost felt like he was a parent stepping back and letting me decide whether it was all about the feelings or whether it was really about him. I came to realise that even if God never spoke to me again, that I wasn't going to stop following him. I wasn't going to stop worshipping him. My feelings, my sense of his presence, that wasn't what was important. This was a God who loved me and who died for me. What were my feelings in comparison to that? I was still in my 20s and still believing that God was preparing me for some task ahead of me. I was in training, I guess, and training takes hard work. Then about 4 months after I turned 30, I faced a test that really shook me to my core, really challenged me about everything that I knew about myself. I woke up one morning and I was really tired. I thought I was just maybe coming down with something. And the next day I went to the gym thinking, get those endorphins pumping, I'll feel better after this. And I just couldn't do the workout I'd done just 2 days previously. The exhaustion was enormous. I could not get past it. And eventually I was diagnosed with having ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. And bit by bit, my life was stripped bare. My business faltered. My friends, I couldn't keep up with them. So I lost many of my friends because they were busy with their lives. If I went out, I couldn't walk far, so I had to use a mobility scooter, or I needed someone to push me in a wheelchair. I couldn't even use my brain. My brain was like mush. I couldn't even read. Watching TV was hard enough. I couldn't keep straight the storylines. But reading, it was just impossible. Everything that I thought was me was being stripped away. Good news was, God started speaking to me again. I was in a really dark place. It was really, really hard. And yet, he was there with me. I learned what it was to rely on him. I didn't have anything else. I had to rely on him. I learned that my faith is not restricted to the good times. It's there and important, all the more important in the bad times. I know that from the start, my mum prayed earnestly for my healing. But there was something that just didn't seem to be about healing for me. I had a sense from God that this was going to be a longer term thing, that he had some stuff to teach me first. I was a bit of a slow learner. It took 4 years before God finally healed me through the birth of my son, Nathan. And what kept me going? I think it was because I knew that through all of that, I was growing, despite my limitations, maybe because of my limitations. God had a purpose in the middle of all of that. I used to think that God had some big job for me. He was preparing me for doing something later in life. But I've come to realize that actually the whole of life is God's preparation ground. It's his training ground. And every difficulty I face, every issue I have to deal with is like steps towards my graduation. As a teacher and a parent, I love to watch kids learn. And it's really interesting because there are generally 2 types of student. There are those that are the high flyers. There are those that can do everything really easily at the drop of a hat. Everything comes easy to them. They're the ones that get the high marks. They're the ones that get the accolades. They're the ones that everybody thinks is going to make a success out of their life. And then you've got the others who find schooling, learning, that bit harder. And some of them give up. Some of them, for whatever reason, find that it's not for them. And they don't achieve an awful lot. But then there are those that decide that whatever the case, however hard it is, they're going to work at it. They're going to figure it out. They're going to try. And they never feel clever. They never feel like they are capable of what they're doing. They always feel like they're having to try hard. They have to earn every achievement. But the research shows that it's that last group of kids that usually do the best in life. Generally speaking, when you look at the measures that our world has for success, maybe making money, maybe having large groups of friends, maybe simply a measure of happiness, those kids in that last group that learned to work hard are the ones that make a success out of their lives. They've learned what it takes, hard work and perseverance. The first group, for whom everything was easy, often find themselves getting to a point in their lives where they're stuck and they have no idea at all how to get unstuck. The earlier I think that you find yourself in that position, the easier it is to learn what it is you need to do to move forward. And I think this perspective of learning and training is what James has in mind in this passage. He says that trials and difficulties are an inevitable part of Christian life. Verse 2 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." It's not if you face trials, it's when you face trials. Even Jesus warns that we will be facing troubles in our lives. In John 16, he says, literally, in this world, you will have trouble. I think the majority of people think that following God is all about keeping him happy so that he will help you. But then when you start thinking of it like that, every bit of suffering is a punishment from God. He's not helping you. You must have done something wrong. But Christianity is different. Our God suffered to bring us redemption. If you want to be like Jesus, then I think you've got to expect suffering. Our modern Western culture doesn't deal with suffering well. I guess it's hard to see beyond your own cultural references, but try and step back and think about what secular culture tells you about the world around you. It tells us that all that we have is the here and now. This is all there is. And if you lose love, if you lose wealth or health in this life, here and now, then you've lost it forever. That's it. Life should be good. And if it isn't, find someone or something to blame. And I think even as a Christian, it's hard to step out of that culture. Yeah, we say we trust Jesus, but it's hard not to start trying to rely on ourselves as well. I think when you look around you at the moment, it's quite clear that all it takes is a tiny little virus to throw everything up in the air. All the things that we rely on naturally have no way of dealing with this kind of crisis. We start to see the weaknesses in the things that we're trusting in. Are you trusting in your job to give you a good life? Well, what happens when you're stuck at home and not able to get out to work and earn things even for the basic essentials, let alone for going on holiday or enjoying those treats that you think make life worthwhile? Maybe it's your bank account that you're trusting in. Maybe you're thinking, I've got plenty of savings, it'll be fine. But when you start looking at weeks and months on end without an income, what does that say? How is your bank account looking? Maybe you're trusting in your own health and fitness to give you a good life. But now you're still stuck at home to protect those who aren't so fit and well. Is your health and fitness actually benefiting you, changing things for you? What happens when you lose one of these things? When you lose your job, when you run out of money, when you lose a loved one or your health? None of them can be relied on forever. So how are we supposed to feel about our suffering? Go back to verse 2. James says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." So are we supposed to be some kind of masochist that just loves to be in pain and suffering? I don't think so. He doesn't say feel happy when you're going through trials. He says consider. Consider means think about. He's telling us to change the way we think about our suffering. Not how we feel about it, how we think about it. Jesus wasn't happy about suffering. He wasn't happy to face it himself. Do you remember the story of Lazarus in John 11? You've got Mary and Martha and Lazarus, who were all friends of Jesus. And Lazarus died. And Jesus goes to their home and he meets with Mary and Martha in the midst of their grief. And in this passage, we get the shortest verse in the Bible. It simply says, Jesus wept. His heart was broken for the pain that his friends were going through. He could see their suffering and his heart broke for them. Then later, he gets taken to the tomb and it says that he was deeply moved. Now, we might read that as another form of sorrow, but actually it's about the original words are about anger, about being furious. And it's as though Jesus is facing the tomb, facing death, and he is furious that this happens in this world. This is not the way he made it. This is not the way that the world should be. Jesus is furious that death exists in this world and it brings hurt and pain and suffering to people that he loves. So if that's the case, if weeping and being angry about injustice is acceptable, is what Jesus does, then how on earth are we supposed to consider it joy? Because James says that going through trials develops perseverance. Just like when I was ill, there were many times when I wanted to give up. I couldn't see how I was any good to anyone. I couldn't see how I was any good to God. And yet I could keep going, bringing every pain, every hurt to God. Struggle by struggle, hurt by hurt, day by day, I could get through because I had to bring it to God. Now, I look back on that time and I am glad I went through it. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to go there again. But I think it was something that made me who I am. It taught me so much about myself, about life, about God. I wouldn't understand the world, understand myself and understand him the way I do now without that experience. As I said, God healed me through my pregnancy with Nathan. And I remember when Nathan was born, the first day that Graham went back to work after he was born, I took the dog out for a walk, which was amazing for me. And I still had energy. So I went out to the Harlequin and took the buggy and we were walking around the Harlequin for a couple of hours. Last time I'd been there, I'd needed my mobility scooter. And yet here I was pushing my precious firstborn around in a buggy and just enjoying being free of that exhaustion. I know most first-time parents are bowled over by how exhausted they are, but by comparison to what I had experienced for those 4 years, this new parenthood was easy. I have to admit, when I had my second, it was that much harder. But still, the experience of ME made a difference in how I parented, in how I could cope with what I had to do, in my attitude to being with the kids and to being tired and to being able to do things. I think it helped me to relax about a lot of stuff that I would have stressed about otherwise. I wouldn't have managed nearly as well without what I learned through those 4 years of ME. I was able to apply what I learned to my new role. And I think that's what verse 4 is all about. James says, "Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Suffering can make you a better person. Suffering can make you a better parent, a better spouse, a better worker, a better friend, a better servant of Jesus. Those trials that you're going through can help you understand your own limitations, can help you understand God's greatness. They can teach you humility and teach you trust. They can teach you empathy. After all, how can you understand someone who is suffering unless you have suffered as well? Actually, going through struggles, going through those trials can actually make you the kind of person who is useful in the life of somebody else. Tim Keller says suffering can turbocharge the ordinary process of Christian growth. That's amazing that God can use this kind of pain and suffering to make us much better people. It's a bit like a smelting furnace where the ore goes in, and through the process of pressure and heat, in the end, what comes out is pure gold. And that is how James wants us to see this. God can bring something good out of the suffering that we're experiencing. It's not just if you look at it a certain way, then really it's not that bad. Because as we've seen with Jesus' reaction to the death of Lazarus, it is. Suffering is bad. Suffering shouldn't be the way it is in this world. We have the right to weep. We have the right to mourn. We have the right to be frustrated, get angry at injustice. We have a situation that should not be. So don't ever feel that those feelings are wrong. But at the same time, understand that God can use those things to do something good, to do something, to make something good inside of you. But that outcome isn't guaranteed. We all know people who've been through suffering and it's left them bitter and hurting, and they hit out at anyone that they perceive as adding to their troubles. How is it that we can do suffering? How can we face it so that what comes out is gold and not dross? I think that's where verses 5 to 8 come in. James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. I don't think these verses are about wisdom in general. I think it's specifically wisdom to do with suffering. I don't know about you, but at the moment I feel somewhat lost when I think about what we're going through as a global community, let alone a local community. I'm not quite sure what to think about this pandemic, about the future, about what to expect over the coming months and years as we get through this process. James says, when you don't know what's going on, or when you don't know how to deal with it, ask God for wisdom. Through prayer, through Bible study, through talking to your friends by phone or Skype, not directly, you might find a toehold, a handhold to get you there, to be able to pull yourself up this mountain that we're facing. During these times of suffering, I think we each have to find our own way over the mountain. God is the one who can show us whatever it is that he wants us to understand, whatever the next thing is that he needs us to change in our lives. There's no point just waiting for the suffering to go away. The strength, the perseverance, the discipline, that's what will take us to maturity. And we need to ask God for wisdom so that we take the right path. But I think James is quite clear that we mustn't ask and doubt. I don't think this word doubt is really about this idea of lack of certainty. James is talking about the person who doubts as being double-minded. Imagine yourself on a ship. To stay in place, you have to have a strung anchor fixed to a fixed point. There's no point putting out lots of anchors to things that move or are unstable. You'll be tossed around by the wind and the waves. Excuse me. So if you are living for another person or a relationship, and that person is more important to you than God, what happens when that relationship breaks down? You effectively are godless. Your anchor has gone. Or what about if you're living for your job and you find yourself out of work? Or money or success or power, and you find yourself unable to do stuff? Your anchor has gone. But let's change the metaphor. Do you remember Jesus' story about the wise and foolish builders? The wise man built his house on the rock. In other words, he built his life on Jesus. The foolish one, he built his house on the sand. In other words, he built his life on anything but Jesus. And when the storms of life came, the house on the rock stood firm, but the house on the sand collapsed. I listened to Tim Keller describe the reality for most Christians like this. He says, our houses, our lives are partly built on the rock and partly built on the sand. In the normal course of events, we feel pretty secure, it's okay. We think our lives are built on the rock, but when the storms come, part of our lives starts to shake, starts to feel unstable. We start to see the parts of our lives that need to be put more under God's control, more on the rock. So by self-examination, by prayer, by Bible study, we gradually push our house, our lives, back onto the rock until it's more stable. And there it sits until the next suffering comes along. Let me give you an illustration from my life. Excuse me. A few weeks back, I was feeling completely overwhelmed by grief for friends of mine. A number of my friends were going through so many problems, so many difficulties, and I just found myself begging God to be with them, begging God to change things for them, begging God to give them peace and relief, and I just felt so overwhelmed by it all. And in that time, I came across somebody writing that pointed out that in the Bible, the majority of prayers are actually prayers of praise. And that really hit home, because all of my prayers were petitions, all of my prayers were begging God to help. So I got a nice notebook that Joan had given me, and I started writing out one of the Psalms that I found that was just full of praise, just everything about what God had done and who God was. And I wrote out verse by verse, and I spent about 45 minutes just writing and writing and writing. And in that process, it was as though I got a glimpse of heaven. It was as though my gaze was lifted up, and that didn't take away the pain and the problems from my friends. It didn't take away the hardship, but I didn't need to be overwhelmed anymore, because I could focus on who God was. I realized that part of my life was about fixing things here on earth, getting things sorted, helping people make things happen. And I realized that actually that's what God is about, that I could focus on him and trust him to do that for my friends and for me. And in the process of that, in the process of that study, that prayer, that writing out that psalm and continuing in that, I learnt to put more of my life back onto the rock, to lean on him, to lean on God, to lean on Jesus, rather than rely on myself. Perhaps this pandemic is challenging you in a different way. Perhaps you're worried about your own health or the health of a loved one. Perhaps you are worried about your finances or how you're going to cope cooped up with your family for the next few weeks or months. Pray for wisdom. Ask God to show you where your anchor is fixed to something that isn't stable, that's not him. Where is your house built on sand instead of rock? Look for the wisdom that he wants to teach you at this time. Find that next toehold, that next handhold to get over this mountain. But keeping with that metaphor, can I just point out that we aren't free climbing with no rope. The one thing that can give you complete confidence, whatever you're going through, is that you're not being asked to do something that God hasn't done already. The start of Hebrews 12 goes like this: Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Facing suffering is not simply about a different perspective. It's not simply about different disciplines that you have to do. It's about building a relationship with the one who died for you. He stayed, he stood fast, he persevered because he loved you. When things are bad, and they will be for all of us at some point, stand fast out of love for the one who loved you first. Fall in love with Jesus so much that you will stand fast for him because he stood fast for you. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that you stood fast for me. On that cross, you took all that should have been coming my way so that I could receive what you deserve. Right now, we're facing really troubled times, and social distancing can make it feel like we're facing them all alone. Lord, I pray that we would each know your presence at this time, that we may learn to bring it to you, to push our lives more and more onto your rock. Amen. Now, teas and coffees are available in your kitchen, and do keep in touch all week with those around you. Have a lovely time, have a lovely week, and I will see you, or not, next week.